The words came quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made them worse. Just don't make a scene tonight, okay? My husband Marcus didn't even look at me when he said it. He was checking his reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusting his tie for the fourth time in 10 minutes, like the knot had personally offended him. Rain streaked down the windshield of his black Audi. We were parked outside a private estate in McLean, Virginia, the kind of neighborhood where the hedges are trimmed with surgical precision and the security cameras cost more than most people's cars. I sat in the passenger seat in my slate blue dress and said absolutely nothing. That was my first mistake. I should have opened the door, walked back into the rain, and called myself a cab. Instead, I smiled, politely, the way you smile when someone says something insulting, but you've decided the evening isn't worth burning down yet. My right knee was already aching, the drive up from Fayetteville had done me no favors, and damp weather turns my knee joint into something that feels like rusted gears trying to find each other. I shifted in the seat and Marcus finally glanced over. You look tense. That's my face, Marcus. He sighed through his nose. I just mean these are serious people, important people. I need tonight to go well. I looked past him at the house. White columns, gold light spilling from every window, a fountain that was still running despite the rain because apparently wealth doesn't pause for weather. Important to who, exactly? To us, he said it like it was obvious. Right, I reached for the door handle. Let me know when us includes me. He got out of the car before I finished the sentence. The valet was a kid barely old enough to vote. He opened my door with professional cheerfulness while I carefully navigated getting out without turning my knee sideways, which, if you've never had cartilage damage, let me tell you, requires the kind of strategic planning they don't cover at the DMV. Marcus was already walking ahead. He paused at the bottom of the steps and looked back, not to help, just to check whether I was keeping up. I grabbed my cane from the back seat. His expression tightened. He said nothing, turned around and walked inside. The inside of the estate looked exactly like what happens when someone with too much money, and no particular personality, tries to look cultured. Marble everything. Oil portraits of men who all appeared vaguely constipated. A string quartet positioned near the staircase playing something that sounded expensive but forgettable. Uniformed waitstaff floated through the crowd with silver trays of miniature food, the kind of appetizers where you eat 6 of them and still go home hungry. Marcus transformed the moment we crossed the threshold. I've watched it happen many times now, but it never stops being strange. His posture changed. His voice dropped half an octave. His laugh, which at home is short and distracted, became a big warm boom that he aimed at people like a spotlight. He started working the room before we'd fully entered it, hand extended, name dropping, chuckling at things that weren't quite jokes. I followed at my own pace. A woman in a silver dress cut across the room directly toward Marcus. Mid-30s, maybe, dark hair, the kind of effortless composure that makes you suspect she's been strategically placed. She touched his arm with the casual ease of someone who'd done it before, many times. Finally, she said, I thought you'd bylade. Marcus's smile hit maximum wattage. Candace, come on, I'd never miss this. He turned and seemed to remember me. This is my wife, Catherine. Candace, his business partner, I was informed, looked at me with practiced warmth. Oh, of course, I've heard wonderful things. That's interesting, I said. Marcus didn't mention you at all. A half-beat of silence. Marcus laughed it off immediately. Cat has a dry sense of humor. She keeps me on my toes. Candace recovered smoothly. So what do you do, Catherine? Before I could answer, Marcus stepped slightly in front of me. She keeps busy, you know how it is. Then, as if throwing a bone, she was in the army, intelligence work, data analysis. I said, that's one way to describe it. Marcus's hand found my elbow, not warm, navigating. Candace tilted her head. That must have been fascinating. Parts of it were. Parts of it I'm legally restricted from discussing at dinner parties. I smiled pleasantly, which is honestly a relief, because the food looks better than the conversation tonight anyway. Candace laughed, genuinely this time. Marcus's grip tightened. You're doing it, he said under his breath. Breathings. Making it about yourself. I looked at him. You introduced me as a hobby. A waiter passed with scotch. I took a glass. My knee was already protesting the marble floors, and we'd been inside for 7 minutes. Marcus had spent the 2 weeks before this dinner talking about one person, General Raymond Fox. Retired four-star general, former theater commander, now a board member across half a dozen defense companies, a cable news fixture, a man whose handshake was described by Marcus as worth 6 figures easy. According to Marcus, Fox attending this fundraiser was the entire reason tonight mattered. He'd rehearsed things to say. He'd bought new cufflinks. So when General Fox entered the ballroom, I noticed Marcus go slightly rigid with readiness, like a hunting dog on point. Fox was in his early 70s, still carried himself the way career military men do, like gravity had tried to negotiate with him and lost. He moved through the room and conversations bent toward him naturally, not from performance, but from something older and quieter than that. Marcus straightened up. General Fox, sir. Fox walked right past him. Didn't slow, didn't turn, just continued on a path that took him directly across the ballroom, threading between tables and conversations, until he stopped 3 feet in front of me. His eyes were sharp and dark and completely cert. Well, he said quietly. The word dropped into the room, like a stone into still water. I set my scotch glass down on the nearest surface, carefully. General. He smiled, not the kind they use on television, something smaller and much heavier. Ghost, he said. My old call sign. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years, not since a forward operating base where the electricity only worked half the time, and we all slept in our boots. Something shifted in my chest. It's been a while, sir. Too long. He reached forward and shook my hand with both of his. Then, in a voice pitched to carry, ladies and gentlemen, this woman served this country in conditions that most people in this room could not survive for 20 minutes. And I mean that without exaggeration. The room didn't go loud. It went the opposite, that specific silence where people stop pretending to be occupied with other things. Marcus had gone the color of uncooked dough. General, you're very generous, I said. Ghost, he replied firmly, I haven't been generous enough. Then, almost as an afterthought, he glanced toward Marcus, a brief glance, the kind you'd give a side table. Your wife, he said simply, is someone you should spend more time listening to. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. Somewhere behind me, a champagne flute touched another. The small sound rang out like a starting pistol. 10 minutes later, I was standing in a bathroom the size of my first apartment, leaning over a marble sink, looking at myself in a mirror surrounded by warm vanity lights that made everyone look like they were being softly interrogated. I looked tired, not politely tired, not the kind that a long weekend would fix. I looked like a woman who'd spent years compressing herself into spaces that were never built for her. The dress fit differently than the last time I'd worn it, surgical recovery, and the medications that followed had reshaped me in ways I hadn't fully accounted for. My right shoulder sat lower than my left. The scar near my collarbone, the one from a field incident I don't discuss at dinner parties, had faded to a pale silvery line. Marcus had stopped noticing it years ago. I wasn't sure he'd ever really seen it. Stand up straight, Catherine, I told the mirror. Then I laughed at myself, which helped marginally. I splashed cold water on my wrists and unlocked the door. An older woman was waiting in the hallway with a champagne flute, and the particular patience of someone who has learned that urgency rarely accomplishes what it promises. Either hiding or crying, she said pleasantly, sometimes both. A little of both, I admitted. Good, she extended her hand. That means you're honest. Vivienne Ashby, Marine Corps widow, retired from 3 different careers and one particularly exhausting marriage. Catherine Mercer, I shook her hand. Something flickered behind her eyes. Mercer, as in the Falcon Ridge Mercers. Unfortunately. She made a soft sound, not unkind. I see. We fell into step together naturally, moving toward a quieter corridor near the library where the noise from the ballroom became a manageable murmur rather than an assault. Were you Army? She asked. Was, though you don't really stop. No, she agreed. You just start wearing different shoes. I smiled. I worked in sensitive assignments, JSOC-adjacent mostly. Vivienne nodded slowly. She understood what that phrase covered and what it covered over, and she was gracious enough not to excavate it. That kind of work leaves a specific kind of mark. Several actually, I tapped my knee. She winced sympathetically. My Earl used to say that the body keeps score even when the mind has moved on. Your Earl was right. We walked quietly for a moment. Then Vivienne said something I wasn't expecting. Men like your husband, she said carefully, don't fall in love with who you are, they fall in love with what standing next to you makes them look like. I stopped walking. I watched him introduce you tonight, she continued, without apology. You were an accessory he'd forgotten to accessorize properly. That's how I started. True, she finished gently. And the frustrating thing was that she wasn't wrong. The more frustrating thing was what I thought about next, because Marcus hadn't always been like this. That version existed. After my second surgery at Walter Reed, he'd slept in a hospital recliner for 4 consecutive nights because I'd woken up disoriented at 2 in the morning more than once, and he'd wanted to be there. You're not going to die, he'd said the second night, when I'd told him I felt like I might. How do you know? Because dying people don't complain with this much structure. I'd laughed hard enough to pull something and cried from the pain, and he'd held my hand through both parts of that. That man had been real, which was exactly what made the man in the ballroom so disorienting. You went somewhere, Vivienne observed. Good memory, I said. That's usually worse than a bad one. I know, she touched my arm lightly. The good memories are what keep us anchored to people longer than we should be. From the library at the end of the hall, voices drifted through a partially open door. One of them was Marcus's. Vivienne raised an eyebrow. Let's listen, I said. Marcus sounded pressured. That specific compression in his voice that appeared when he was trying to manage something. All I'm saying is Catherine hasn't been entirely herself lately. Since the surgeries, there's been, he paused, memory issues, gaps. The medications complicate things. Another voice, measured and careful. That's a significant thing to say about your spouse, Mr. Mercer. I'm just being transparent. She sometimes misremembers conversations, gets the sequence of events confused. I stood absolutely still in the hallway. Vivienne had gone quiet beside me. And then, like a key turning in a lock, a dozen small moments from the past year rearranged themselves into a pattern I hadn't seen before. Marcus gently correcting my account of conversations in front of friends. Marcus joking, at a contractor dinner, that I still had some wiring crossed from my field days. Marcus saying twice, in the presence of other people, that I sometimes got the timeline confused. He'd been building something. Slowly, carefully, the way you lay a foundation so gradually that nobody notices until the walls are already up. The other voice spoke again. And you believe she'd misinterpret financial records if she encountered them. Financial records. I stepped into the doorway. Marcus went rigid. The other man turned, mid-50s, government-bearing, the particular economy of movement that comes from spending years in official buildings. He extended his hand before Marcus could speak. David Crane, Department of Defense Inspector General's Office. Catherine Mercer, I shook it, I know. Marcus found his voice. Catherine, this is a private conversation. Interesting, I said. My cognitive reliability apparently isn't. Crane watched us both with the careful neutrality of a man who had sat through many versions of this scene. Marcus tried another angle. You're upset, that's understandable, but you're reading this wrong. My medications, I said evenly, cause stomach issues and joint inflammation, not memory loss, not confusion, and not, I looked at him directly, misinterpretation of financial fraud. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Crane cleared his throat. Mrs. Mercer, would you be available to speak with my office this week? Marcus started to answer for me. I talked over him. Thursday works. And for the first time all evening, my husband looked genuinely, completely afraid. Federal agents arrived at our house on a Wednesday morning at 6:47. I was in the kitchen in an old base sweatshirt with a coffee stain above the left pocket, standing on one slipper and looking for the other one, when someone knocked on the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it. 6 agents, 2 black vehicles, and standing in the center of the group, wearing a field jacket and a tired expression, was Colonel Dominic Reyes. Kandahar, 2011. A night when the power went out across the whole forward operating base, and we ran the entire operation on backup generators and stubbornness. Reyes, I said. Morning, Cat. He looked me over with the particular care of someone cataloging damage without commenting on it. You look like you haven't slept. You look like you drove all night. I did. He held up a folder. Federal warrant, Falcon Ridge Strategic Outreach. The company name hit my stomach like cold water on an open wound. I stepped back. Come in. The house looked different with 6 federal agents moving through it. Real life tends to look different when strangers star. Tea cataloging it, the dishes in the sink, the stack of medical bills on the counter, the second-hand bookshelf Marcus had always hated and I'd always refused to replace. Reyes stayed near me while I poured coffee with hands that were not entirely steady. How bad? I asked. He looked into his mug for a moment. Bad enough they moved fast, which usually means the evidence was solid before they started. Marcus came downstairs in stages, confused, then alarmed, then furious in that particular order. What is this? He stood at the kitchen entrance in pajamas, looking at the agents with the expression of a man who has never had to account for anything and cannot immediately locate the framework for starting. An agent stepped forward. Federal investigation, sir. Please don't obstruct. Marcus spotted Reyes. You brought the military into this. You did, Reyes said simply. Marcus looked at me. His eyes ran the calculation in real time, the search for an angle, a narrative, a position to take that still gave him options. Dana, he'd started occasionally calling me by the wrong name when he was trying to destabilize me. I'd noticed it months ago. Say something. I said. I'm saying nothing. An agent carried 2 file boxes out of the home office. Marcus moved to block the doorway. That's proprietary material. That's potentially fraudulent material, the agent said, and kept walking. The word hung in the kitchen. Fraud. Marcus changed tactics immediately. He came toward me slowly, lowered his voice. Catherine, listen, if you stand with me publicly, just appear with me, this gets manageable. Fox respects you. The donors respect you. I need you to. You told a federal investigator I was cognitively impaired 3 days ago. I was protecting us. You were building an escape route out of my medical history. I kept my voice level. Those are different things. He ran a hand through his hair. I took care of you, after surgeries, after everything, I was there. You were, I said, and I was grateful, I still am. I looked at him carefully. But staying doesn't create a debt that can be collected like this. He was quiet for a moment. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I answered. Catherine, Candace's voice, tight, controlled. I need you to know I gave them everything. Emails, wire transfer records, the false veteran outreach filings, the investor presentation materials. Marcus heard her voice from across the kitchen. Something moved across his face, not quite panic, but the thing that comes right before it. There's something else, Candace continued. He drafted a document. A statement, in case any of this came out. It attributes the accounting discrepancies to you, to cognitive disruption stemming from military trauma and pharmaceutical dependency. The kitchen went absolutely still. I looked at Marcus. He looked at the window. And something that had been fraying quietly for a long time, some last remaining thread of the version of him I'd been holding onto, finally, cleanly, broke. Send me everything, I said. Already done. I ended the call. Marcus turned toward me. Catherine. Don't, I said quietly. Just that one word. But I used the voice I'd used in forward operating bases and field briefings and rooms where the stakes were genuinely mortal. He heard it. His mouth closed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up my coffee, walked to the kitchen table, and sat down to wait for whatever came next. 3 weeks later, Marcus held the fundraiser anyway. I've turned that fact over in my mind many times since, and I still can't decide if it was arrogance or desperation or some combination of the two that is actually its own specific category of self-destruction. Federal investigators had frozen accounts. Donors were quietly making calls. His name was appearing in the kind of DC circles where appearances are everything, but in the wrong tone. And he scheduled a waterfront gala in Annapolis. I almost didn't go. My knee was at about 60% that afternoon. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, with an ice pack wrapped around it, staring at the dress hanging from the closet door, deeply unconvinced that anything about the evening was worth the joint inflammation. Marcus appeared in the doorway, cufflinks already in. Are you ready? Physically or philosophically? He sighed. I know things have been difficult. You drafted a document blaming my military-related brain damage for your financial crimes. Difficult is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He was quiet, then. I need you there tonight. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked older than he had a month ago. Something had gone out of him, not his confidence exactly, but his certainty that confidence was enough. I'll come, I said finally. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't to destroy him. It wasn't strategy or revenge. Part of it was that I still, against most availab. La evidence felt something when I looked at him, not love exactly anymore, but the grief of where love used to be, which turns out to be its own specific weight. And part of it was that I was tired of disappearing. The venue was a ballroom overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. White tablecloths with small American flags in the centerpieces. A jazz quartet near the bar. The specific aesthetic of people using patriotism as interior design. The room was full contractors, veterans, local political figures, a few reporters, the particular ecosystem that surrounds defense money in this region. Marcus worked the room like a man, running from something he couldn't outrun. I found General Fox near the front. He looked at me and said nothing. Just nodded once, the way people do when they already know what's coming and they've decided to bear witness. Candace was there too. Plain dark suit, no warmth in her posture when Marcus moved near her. She caught my eye once across the room. I looked away. At 7:30, Marcus took the stage. The room settled. Tonight, he said, is about something bigger than any of us. It's about service, sacrifice, the men and women who gave. He kept talking. I stopped listening to the words and started watching the room. The subtle shifts in posture at certain tables, the reporters who were writing things down, the donors who were exchanging small glances. And no one knows service like my wife, Catherine. He gestured toward me. She has faced tremendous challenges since returning from her military career, struggles that none of us can fully appreciate. Several people turned to look at me. And there it was, the setup, dressed in admiration. Broken woman, sacrificial veteran, a human character reference being deployed as preemptive sympathy. I stood up. Getting to my feet with a cane in front of a room full of people takes a moment. It doesn't look dramatic. It just takes time. But the room went quiet anyway, because people sense when something has shifted. Marcus's smile held, but his eyes asked a very specific question. I made my way to the stage. He leaned toward me when I reached him. What are you doing? Finishing a sentence, I said. I held out my hand toward the microphone. He hesitated. I took it. I've never been comfortable with rooms. Not the way some people are. I don't like the way sound bounces. I don't like the collective held breath. But I've stood in places where saying the wrong thing had consequences measured in lives, and this wasn't that. This was just the truth. My name is Catherine Mercer, I said. My voice was steadier than my hands. Some of you knew me by a different name once. In a different context. From the front table, quietly, General Fox said, "Ghost." A few heads turned toward him immediately. The word moved through the room in small waves. "I didn't come here tonight to make a scene," I continued. "Truthfully, I came because I'm still figuring out how to stop making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. That habit takes a long time to break." Marcus moved closer to me. His voice was barely audible. "Catherine, stop." "I was decorated for intelligence work that I can't fully describe in this room," I said. "I've had 3 knee surgeries, 1 shoulder reconstruction, and more nights than I can count where I wasn't sure I'd sleep again. That's not a tragedy. That's just the receipt." I paused. "What I will not do is allow those facts to be used as a narrative of instability in a fraud investigation." The room shifted. That specific shift, not loud, just dense, like pressure changing before weather arrives. Marcus stepped in front of me. "She's not well," he said to the room. It came out louder than he intended. "This isn't, she's dealing with things." "I'm dealing," I agreed, "with a federal document in which my husband attributed his company's fraudulent financial activity to my cognitive impairment, which was drafted, I'm told, sometime between his 3rd and 4th investor calls last month." Silence. Not the polite kind, the kind that has weight. Marcus turned to me, just to me. The room disappeared for him, and I watched something crack open in his face, not guilt exactly, but something more raw. Something that had been pressurized for a long time. "You made me feel small," he said. His voice was low, but in that silence it carried. "Every room, every event, every time we walked in somewhere and people looked at you the way they looked at you," he stopped, swallowed. "Do you know what that's like? Do you have any idea?" I answered him honestly. I always did. "No," I said. "I don't, because I never needed the room to look at me. I needed one person to." He stared at me. At the front table, General Fox stood. He buttoned his jacket with 2 slow, deliberate movements. He looked at me, held my gaze for a moment, and then turned and walked toward the exit without a word. That was all it took. A retired colonel at a center table. Rows, then 2 men near the windows. A Gold Star mother who I didn't know but who nodded at me as she stood. 3 naval officers who filed out together quietly. One by one, no speech, no commotion, just people leaving. The reporters were already moving. Candace picked up her bag and walked without looking at Marcus. He said weakly, "Wait." Nobody waited. I handed the microphone to the nearest staff member, turned around carefully on my cane, and walked back through a ballroom that was half empty and going quieter by the second. Marcus called me 3 weeks later from a number I didn't recognize. I was in the kitchen of my rental house near the bay, blue siding, a porch just big enough for 1 chair, pipes that made sounds like they had opinions. I was rinsing strawberries when the phone buzzed. I answered before I fully decided to. "You sound tired," I said. "I am tired." A pause, long enough that I could hear the bay wind through my window. "I miss you." The words landed in a place I'd been trying to keep quiet. "I think," I said carefully, "you miss being forgiven." "That's not fair." "Marcus," I set down the strawberries. "You drafted a document that said my military service had left me cognitively compromised. You were going to use that, in a federal proceeding, against me." I was panicking. "You'd been building it for months. Casually, in front of people, little comments, small corrections, you were laying groundwork in case you needed it." Silence. "The company's gone," he said finally. I said nothing. "The house too, and they're talking charges. A breath. Wire fraud, charitable fund misuse." I looked out toward the water. Gray and flat in the late afternoon light, 2 gulls arguing over something on the dock. "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it. Not for his financial losses. For whatever version of him had made those choices. For the distance between the man who held my hand in a hospital room and the man who drafted that document. "You destroyed me," he said quietly. And that was the moment something finally hardened completely. "No," I said. "You built a structure that depended on my silence to stay standing. I stopped being silent. That's not destruction. That's just what happens when a weight-bearing wall turns out to have been a person. He was quiet for a long time. Then I stayed with you when things were hard, when you were broken. He said it carefully, the hospital chair, the 2 a.m. hand-holding. He knew exactly what he was invoking. You did, I said. And I was grateful, I am grateful. I moved to the window. But kindness in a crisis is not a down payment on someone's silence. Loving someone through their pain doesn't give you ownership of their dignity afterward. Another long pause. Then very quietly, I really did love you. I closed my eyes. Sometimes, I said honestly, I think you did. Then I hung up. That was the last time we spoke. Federal charges came through officially 6 weeks later. Wire fraud, misappropriation of charitable funds, false financial disclosures to investors. Candace cooperated fully with investigators. Several of the contractors who used to embrace Marcus at fundraisers discovered, with impressive speed, that they'd never been particularly close to him at all. Loyalty in those circles runs until the legal exposure starts, and then it runs the other direction. I moved into the rental house permanently. Second-hand table, mismatched mugs, a small ceramic lighthouse I bought at a roadside shop because it made me smile and I needed things that made me smile. My knee still swelled when storms came in from the bay. I still woke up some nights at 3 in the morning from dreams I couldn't fully name. Some mornings grief sat at my kitchen table like an uninvited guest that hadn't gotten the memo. But something else happened too. Vivienne Ashby called me about 6 weeks after the fundraiser. She and a few other women were putting together a support network for women veterans in the Norfolk area. Nothing official, nothing funded. Just practical help, VA paperwork, transportation, someone to sit with women post-surgery who didn't want to be alone in a hospital room. Real work. Useful work. The kind that doesn't get plaques. I said yes without thinking about it. On the third Thursday of every month, we met at a VFW hall with folding chairs and burnt coffee and store-bought cookies. The building smelled like old wood and pine cleaner, and something else. Decades of people sitting together through things they couldn't say anywhere else. I was setting out napkins one afternoon when Vivienne came through the door carrying 2 enormous shopping bags. You bought enough food for a battalion, I said. Women underestimate how emotional they get around mini brownies. She set the bags on the table and looked at my laptop. That website still looks like it was designed during an outage. It works. So does duct tape. Doesn't mean we lead with it. The front door opened. General Fox walked in wearing a plain gray suit. No entourage, no handlers. A folder under one arm and the bearing of a man who doesn't require context to enter a room. He stopped when he saw me. Ghost. I shook my head. General, I'm standing in a VFW hall with swollen joints and a box of store-brand cookies. The call sign feels like a reach right now. He smiled. It was the same smile from the ballroom, old and heavy. Legends can buy cookies. That's very reassuring. He crossed the room and handed me an envelope. Inside was a single card. Handwritten, no military formality, just one sentence. Ghost doesn't retire, she changes battlefields. I stared at it longer than I expected. Then I laughed. That sounds extremely expensive as a cross-stitch pillow. Fox nodded. Vivienne's line, actually. From across the hall, without looking up from her brownie arrangement, Vivienne said flatly, "Damn right it is." The room filled with laughter. The kind that happens in rooms where people have carried things and set them down and found, to their surprise, that their arms still work. I want to be honest about something before I finish. Recovery doesn't look the way movies make it look. It isn't a single moment, a confrontation, an exit, a microphone being handed back with quiet dignity. It's slower, less cinematic. Some mornings it's just managing to get the knee brace on correctly and eat something before noon. Some weeks it's 3 steps forward and 1 step sideways into a grief that takes 3 days to walk back out of. I still miss who I thought Marcus was. I probably will for a long time. The version from the hospital room. The version who knew that I was funny at 2 in the morning when I was describing my own potential death. That version is gone, or maybe he was never permanent, and both possibilities are things I'm still sitting with. But here is what I know. I am not the sum of what someone else needed me to be. My military record is not a credential that can be borrowed. My pain is not a narrative that can be edited for someone else's defense. My silence was never a kindness I owed anyone. For years, I believed that making myself smaller was a form of loyalty. I now understand it was closer to permission. Permission for someone to define the space I occupied, the story I was part of, the version of me that got to exist publicly. I have my name back now. My voice. The particular stillness that comes from knowing you've stopped lying, even quietly, even to protect someone who didn't deserve the protection. My knee still aches when it rains. I still wake up at 3 in the morning sometimes. But the room I wake up in is mine. And nobody borrows that anymore. If this story stayed with you, thank you for staying with it. And if you're somewhere in the middle of rebuilding yourself after betrayal, after silence, after years of shrinking to fit someone else's comfort, you're not weak for staying as long as you did. You're not broken for still missing who they used to be. And you are not required to keep being small just because someone depended on it. Start with one room, make it yours. That's enough to begin.